Good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome you to the 2013 Aspen Ideas Festival. We're delighted to see all of you, and we know over the next few days there's going to be a packed agenda. It's really a feast for the intellect, and we're very happy that you're here to share it with all of us. My name is Meryl Chertoff, and I'm director of the Justice and Society program at the Aspen Institute. We've prepared a report today, Principal Pluralism, the report of the Inclusive America Project. Copies were available as you came into the auditorium, and there'll be copies available on the way out if you didn't pick one up. And I wanted to start off by telling you about the origins of the Inclusive America Project, one of the projects of the Justice and Society program. Following the controversy over the Park 51 development, also known as the Ground Zero Mosque, we at the Justice and Society program became very concerned about what we saw as an increasing polarization in the discussion over religion in America. This wasn't the version of religious diversity that we knew. We remember in America where Martin Luther King linked arms with other ministers, with rabbis, and with imams, and marched for civil rights. We remember an America where there is an easy flow of conversation between people of diverse religious backgrounds. But as the United States becomes increasingly diverse, as we come to an America where there isn't a single majority religion, and as the world grows increasingly flat, we knew that the question of religious diversity in America as a force for good was something that we were going to need to approach with a greater degree of intentionality. We had a program at Aspen's office in Washington, D.C. in 2011 where we partnered with one of our panelists here today, Ibu Patel of the Interfaith Youth Corps, to have a discussion about how we can best engage America's religious diversity in a positive way. The response to that panel, which was attended by a very diverse group, was so positive that we decided to create the Inclusive America Project. And the Inclusive America Project proceeded by way initially of a distinguished panel of 23 individuals, co-chaired by David Gergen, who's here with us today, and Secretary Madeleine Albright. The group consisted of leaders in the religious community, scholars of theology, individuals from youth services organizations, from religiously affiliated organizations, from the media, and from government. And we came together in 2 sessions to discuss the question of religious pluralism in America, and the group came together and created recommendations in 5 sectors: university, youth service, and by youth service we meant the places where kids go after school from 3 o'clock to whenever a parent or caretaker comes to get them, and during the summer also when kids are not in school. Religiously affiliated organization, the media, and government. Recommendations were made in those 5 sectors, but not only recommendations, but also action steps, because as a result of this report, members of our distinguished panel, and we hope all of you, will become engaged with this issue and take back recommendations and best practices that are noted in the report to help to build a more inclusive America. In addition to our recommendations, we also have a wonderful essay by our 2 co-chairs and an essay by Professor David Campbell, who with Robert Putnam of Harvard co-authored a book called American Grace, one of the best treatments of American religious diversity over the past few years. Our concerns led to this report. And we made 3 essential recommendations. We focused on encouraging respect in the public sphere for the religious identity of individuals and groups, fostering positive relationships and informed dialogue between people of different spiritual orientations, and forging partnerships among religious organizations and others in service to the common good. We have 3 panelists here with us today to discuss the Inclusive America Report. David R. Gergen is the co-director of the Center for Public Leadership and professor of public service at Harvard Kennedy School. He's a trustee of the Aspen Institute, and he's also a senior political commentator at CNN. Ibu Patel is the founder and president of the Interfaith Youth Corps, also a member of our panel, and recently was with the Advisory Council on Neighborhood and Faith-Based Partnerships at the White House. E.J. Dionne is the senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution and a Washington Post columnist. We're delighted to have all of them here today. Before I throw the questions to our panelists first, E.J. spoke last night at a presentation on the Franklin Project, and he quoted a good range of quotes, from Rabbi Hillel to John Winthrop. And so he sent me scurrying back to my study last night. So not to be outdone, I wanted to start it off with a quote from George Washington's letter to the Truro Synagogue from 1790. And the first president said, "It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens." So as early as the founding of our country, the notion that what religion meant to us was something that went beyond mere tolerance, was something that embraced all religions for their equal dignity, is part of America's DNA. So I wanted to start by throwing it open and directing the first question to David Gergen. David, why did you decide to become involved with the Inclusive America Project? And how has your experience with the Inclusive America Project shifted your views on religious pluralism?
Walter Isaacson broke my arm. I joined up partly because I thought it was such a good group and such an important topic. Madeline was going to be a co-chair. And we had some outstanding individuals who were interested in helping, not only Robert Putnam, but Diana Eck, David Little, a number of people, and Jim Wallace, I knew was going to be signing up. That had an attraction to it. And let me just say a little bit more, if I could, about the report itself. First of all, to salute Aspen, Walter, and the Justice and Society program, especially Merrill, for organizing this and driving this process forward. I think it's because of Merrill that we now have a report in hand, very attractive, and I would tell you that the report itself is very thoughtful. There are no silver bullets to the questions that arise here, but if you look at the totality of this report, I think you find that there's a great deal here that people can build upon constructively. It was some years ago that Arthur Schlesinger Jr. wrote a book called E Pluribus Unum, about the national motto, from many one. And what Arthur was arguing in those days was that we had too much pluribus and not enough unum. And he was arguing at that time when there was racial, ethnic tensions in the country, and he was really worried about the direction in which we were going. And I would say since then, we've made enormous progress on that the diversity, Bill Clinton used to argue when he was president that diversity must be our friend, not our enemy. Diversity must be our friend, not our enemy. And we have largely moved in a direction of embracing diversity in our lives, in our workplaces, in our places of worship, and well beyond that. So it's regarded as terribly it is deeply offensive now to display the kind of attitudes or kind of activities that one found acceptable, say back in the 60s or even the early 70s. We've come a long, long way on that issue. The question now becomes, can we move in a similar way on religious diversity? Can we move in a similar way to embrace religious diversity? And as Meryl said, the difference is about being intentional. This report is, let's get this issue up on the table and become quite intentional about how we approach religious diversity and move toward pluralism, something that Meryl will come back to. Ibu has been working on this field a great deal. I think it's striking, and what was partly good about this report was there were so many different views represented. And even on this panel, we were noting just before we came up here, Meryl's Jewish, I'm a Protestant, Ibu's a Muslim, EJ is a Catholic, and waiting in the wings quickly, Jim Wallace. Jim Wallace is an evangelical Protestant. Many different voices. Meryl said, well, it wasn't accidental. As she planned this, Bill Clinton used to say, if you find a turtle on top of a fence post, it didn't get there by itself. So here's where we are in all of this. America, by and large, has actually a very good positive record of which we can be proud about the way we have lived in a religiously diverse nation for a long, long time. One of the central arguments that Robert Putnam makes from his study of religions worldwide is that if you look at countries that are highly religious and are also highly diverse, they usually have a great deal of trouble. In fact, he said there are many, many failed states that come out of that. If you have people who are devout and also diverse, that leads to a lot of trouble. We had big arguments about India, whether, if you look at the early history of India, that was true. If you look at the later history, it's not true. But in any event, the United States stands out in that regard as having a very devout public. If you look at surveys asking, do you believe in God, or do you attend church, you get very, very high numbers in the U.S. versus the OECD. There was one poll in France, which was, I think, points to the ambiguity. In Europe, they asked, do you believe in God? And 60% said no. Second question, do you believe that Jesus Christ was the living Son of God? 56% say yes. So what the hell do you make of that? EJ, well, you and I have worked with a lot of polling. But what we realized as a group, as we talked about it, is that even though we have this very good record, there are signs of danger lurking beneath the surface, and we need to deal with them because they could, in fact, at a time that we're highly polarized as a society politically, they could come back and bite us in a variety of different ways. One, the most obvious, is the question it was touched off by 9/11, but we saw renewed by the Boston bombing, and that is the response to Muslims because of extremists. And Ibu lives with this every day. And how do we deal with the jihadists and condemn extremism while embracing Muslims? That's a question we're wrestling with as a society. I would say another one, which EJ knows so well, is the way that religion has become injected into our politics and has become part of the polarization. When evangelicals actually came back into politics, and they did so because they felt that their way of life was being taken away from them, by the prayer in schools decision, by Roe v. Wade, and by other things. They thought they had to get off the sidelines to get into politics. When they first got into politics, they supported Jimmy Carter. They put Jimmy Carter in the White House back in 1976, but then they became disillusioned with Carter, and they went to Reagan in 1980, and they've been mostly in the Republican camp since. So, but increasingly, as the Republicans are seen as very closely allied with the religious right, we have the Democratic Party increasingly associated now with the rise of the nuns. And these are the people who have no religious affiliation. And now that was a small number before. 20% of our population now says they have no religious affiliation. 30% of young people say they have no religious affiliation. And they are mostly going into the Democratic Party. That is contributing to a tension that has a very strong religious dimension. So we have to be aware of this and act on it, and this report is all about what those actions might be. I'll leave it there.
Wow. Okay. Well, Ibu, you've been working on college campuses for a number of years, and you see the entire range in the college campus. young people with strong religious views, young people who are unaffiliated or are nuns, and also a lot of young people who are together for the first time away from their parents' home. What has your experience been?
Sure. So I've run the Interfaith Youth Corps for 15 years. It's all of my professional life. I remember when I told my dad I was in graduate school that I wasn't going to walk the tenure track at a university. I was going to start this nonprofit called Interfaith Youth Corps. He said, "We immigrated from India for this." Anyway, 15 years later, I'm on this stage. My dad is proud of that, I should say. So let me say, in 15 years, I think that the publication of this report is as landmark a moment as I've seen in 15 years of doing this work. And a huge thank you to Meryl, to Joe, to Marty Budd, to Walter Isaacson, to David, to everybody to all of those people who made it happen. Because of the thoughtfulness of the report, because of its focus, and because of its emphasis on action. So let me actually first do some kind of context about the work IFYC does on college campuses, hooking the report in. As David said, what the research shows is that nations that are highly diverse and reasonably devout oftentimes have a track record of conflict. Interestingly, the United States is the most religiously diverse nation, some scholars say, in human history, and the most religiously devout nation in the West at a time of global religious conflict. Right? Faith in any of these situations can be a bubble of isolation, it can be a barrier of division, it can be a bomb of destruction, which is the story we see in the evening news, or it can be a bridge of cooperation. And I think one of America's great challenges in the 21st century, given its demographics and given the storyline in the evening news, is how do we make sure faith is a bridge of cooperation, a bridge that is both increasing our social capital and that's strengthening our social cohesion. And I think this report goes right at that point. Now, let me point out three things that I think are especially important about this report. Number one, as Meryl began with, it is a reaffirmation of America's ethos of pluralism, or America's aspiration of pluralism. I think you can read American history as a dynamic of the forces of prejudice and battling the forces of pluralism, and in chapter after chapter, the forces of pluralism have won, but that doesn't mean it's inevitable, right? So the question is, what do we do right now? What does our generation do to make sure that faith is a bridge of cooperation in this era? And this report puts a stake firmly in that ground, quoting everything from Washington to the Flushing Remonstrance to the fact that in the terrible Boston bombings, it was doctors from different religious traditions doing emergency operations on those hundreds of people who were injured, right? That's the America we want to build, and we have to work for it. The second thing I think that's important about this report is that it looks at social science data in terms of what we've learned about effectiveness in interfaith cooperation. Any field worth its salt has a discourse around effectiveness, whether it's literacy or environmentalism or poverty alleviation. We're starting to develop that around interfaith cooperation. And this report highlights that. At IFYC, we like to call this the interfaith triangle, the fact that positive attitudes, meaningful relationships, and appreciative knowledge of different religions are linked. So the language we like to use is, how do you work the interfaith triangle? How do you facilitate meaningful relationships between people who orient around religion differently? How do you spread appreciative knowledge, and therefore therefore getting more positive attitudes? And the final part of this report that I think is genuinely genius is the focus on action, is the Meryl inviting leaders of several sectors, from John DeGioia, who's the president of Georgetown University, to the guy who runs the Huffington Post religion section, to major elements of government, and saying, what are you going to do to make interfaith cooperation a social norm? Effectively, how are you going to help us achieve the American aspiration of religious pluralism by integrating the science of interfaith cooperation within your sector? I think that's the stage we're at in this movement. So what we do at Interfaith Youth Corps is focus on higher education. Our kind of thesis is that if we can help America's 2,800 four-year institutions of higher education become models of interfaith cooperation, places where that interfaith triangle is kind of naturally being worked, and if we can train a generation of college students to view themselves as interfaith leaders in a similar way as previous generations viewed themselves as human rights activists or civil rights workers, we have a chance to achieve the American aspiration of religious pluralism.
EJ, you are not one of our task force members, but you have done work also in this area. And last night at the Franklin Project discussion, you talked about the role that government has to play. And government is very reluctant, obviously, to get involved with religion because of First Amendment considerations. and yet we made recommendations regarding the positive role that government can play. What do you think government can do to help create an atmosphere in which that engagement takes place? There is a White House office of engagement with religious communities that was started under George Bush, continued and expanded under President Obama. Does government have any role, and if so, what ought it to be?
Well, the government's core role in this area is to follow the Constitution of the United States, which actually is a pretty good guide. I just want to say, since I'm the one person up here who had nothing to do with this report, it's a really good report. And one of the things I particularly admired is at the end, I write op-ed pieces. There are a series of very short essays that are really very thoughtful, and I commend them to you. The other thing I want to say about America as an interfaith place, one of the other things I do, I'm fortunate enough to be a professor at Georgetown, and one day I was going to teach, and I found myself in a terrible traffic jam waiting to go to my class, and I asked somebody, what is this traffic about? And somebody told me it's for Yom Kippur. Now, as many of you know, Georgetown is a Catholic and a Jesuit institution. We also have at Georgetown the largest Yom Kippur service in the city of Washington. And I love that about Georgetown and its tradition of interfaith engagement. As Yogi Berra said upon learning that the Lord Mayor of Dublin was Jewish, only in America. I think that we have a very peculiar and blessed history in this sphere, even though we shouldn't have any illusions about the fact that as a nation, we have had a lot of fights on this matter. There were riots in Philadelphia in the 1840s over which version of the Bible and the Ten Commandments should be used in the public schools. We had the Ku Klux Klan, we had the Know Nothing movement, we had Al Smith, who was not elected president in part because he was Catholic, and John Kennedy, who had to struggle to get elected president because he was Catholic. One of my favorite stories out of that campaign is after he won the West Virginia primary. This was supposed to put the religious issue to bed. Then about 2 or 3 weeks later, the Vatican came out with a statement that the church had a right to instruct Catholics how to vote, which raised the whole Catholic issue again. Kennedy looks at his aides and says, now I know why Henry VIII started his own church. And so to go to your question, that is not what I think the United States government should do. When I say follow the Constitution, one of the great essays in this book is by Rabbi David Saperstein, and although I'm Catholic, I always tell David he's my rabbi. And he said, the genius of the Constitution's 3 prongs regarding religion, no religious test for office, no law respecting an establishment of religion, and free exercise of religion, created for the first time in human history a nation in which citizens' rights and opportunities were guaranteed regardless of religious identity, practices, or beliefs. And I think in the American history of pluralism, we have found ways for government to cooperate with the religious sphere without ever promoting any specific faith. And that if you look at so much charitable work done in the country, there's a great deal of it that is done through cooperation between government and religious groups, but with very important sort of picket fences around that work. The government can't finance the conversion of people. And I also think in promoting the spirit of openness, what the government always needs to think about is sort of 3 forms of prejudice that we have to fight against. The obvious one that we all know about is freedom from prejudice against members of individual faiths. I think with the rise of the nuns, that's N-O-N-E-S, nuns are very dear to me personally, the other kind of nuns. We also need to be free of prejudice against people with no faith at all, with no formal religious faith, and people who aren't, or people who just aren't affiliated. But the third, and this is one of the things I hope we talk about, is we need to be free of prejudice against non-believers, against believers, rather. And I think that when you look at the rise of strong religious feeling, particularly among our more conservative evangelical brethren, I think some of it comes from a perception, not always fair, and I say this as a liberal, that liberals somehow harbor prejudice against people of faith. They somehow view them as sort of less rational or less thoughtful. I think that's a big mistake on the part of liberals, because I think if you are a liberal, your job is to be free of prejudice, period. And I also think that when people get that feeling of other people being bigoted against them, it raises defense mechanisms that can lead to some really ugly displays, kind of as a form of backlash. So I think we got to keep those three freedoms from prejudice in our heads at the same time, and I think government always needs to operate with those three freedoms in mind.
Well, you bring up a very interesting point, EJ, about the way that people perceive this. And of course, a lot of the way that we perceive this is based on what we read in the media. So David, I want to throw this to you first. How well does the media do in telling stories about religion or in telling stories about people of different faiths interacting with each other?
Not very well. I think it, but I think it does a better job with the religion than it does with politics. Let me say, I think the biggest fear about the media has been whether it would sensationalize every act of violence or threat coming from a Muslim over the last 10 years. And I was actually pleasantly surprised and pleased with the Boston bombing. That there were some mistakes made, but living in Boston, going through that, I was very aware how much restraint was being displayed by most of the media most of the time, and I think that incident has now sort of passed without a great spike in anti-Muslim feeling. Do you feel that? Do you agree with that, Eben?
I would say broadly speaking, I mean, I'm always concerned about what, seventh grade
Right.
girls are going through in junior high.
Sure,
around
but I
this
mean,
stuff.
how did you think the media handled it?
I thought that relatively speaking, there was, by the mainstream media, a relative amount of restraint.
Yeah.
I agree.
And I thought partly because it came as a total shock that this was somehow connected to Chechnya. Most
Yeah.
Americans had not even heard of that conflict, and it sort of came at them out of nowhere.
They hadn't heard of Chechnya.
Chechnya, right? Yeah.
I think that's right, but it didn't. It wasn't. It could have led to a very explosive situation had it been covered in a different way. If people had been competing against each other to get audience by really slurring the individuals, and instead I thought there was a certain kind of maturity, if one can call it that I think we should welcome. Now, that's not to say, though, that the media has learned how to deal with a lot of issues that relate to how we live with each other. And there is a tendency to look for the worst and not give emphasis or give much coverage to the best and the better angels of our nature. And I think that is true in religion. I think it's true in service work. A lot of organizations that are doing wonderful things for this country get very, very little attention that we can come back to. But I think what increasingly has become apparent is that, and what the report recommends, is that religious groups, religious institutions actually take it upon themselves to be more proactive, to learn to tell their stories better. That this isn't something you can just leave to the media. You have to bring to them those stories that have a human appeal, that do give us new insight. And there are places there are outlets where you will find, CBS Sunday Morning has been a place, for example, where stories like this might appear, and I think those have been very helpful. But I don't think that the media tends to be a lagging organization, not a leading organization. It tends to follow the culture. And in that sense, we've got to make sure the culture gets right, and I think the media will, in effect, come along.
Could I just say something quick on that? I think there is, and I've sort of tried to explain the media's tendency to look more at bad news than good news for about 35 or 40 years of my life, and I think it's natural that we don't focus, the sun came up today kind of news. And yet, I think in this area especially, the focus on harsh controversy can get in the way of seeing the whole picture of what America's like. The examples I would use are on the one hand, that evangelical minister down in Florida who wanted to burn a Quran. Everybody heard about that. and Jim Wallace is in the audience, and he
here.
was the first person who told me about this, so I want him to
right here.
correct me on this. There you are. Is this wonderful evangelical church in Tennessee, if I remember right, where there was a mosque being built in the community. Everybody was worried there was some bigotry and prejudice, and the pastor of that evangelical church basically put up a sign welcoming his Muslim neighbors, and these two churches had a kind of fellowship. And the evangelical minister diffused what could have been an explosive situation, but not only that, he sort of presented a picture of what American religious pluralism and freedom should be about. I suspect many more people in the audience, I could be wrong, heard about the guy burning the Quran than about the evangelical minister who welcomed his new Muslim neighbors.
Right, exactly, exactly.
And that's a problem, I think.
That is a problem. It's a very big problem. People, look, a lot of reporters can get on the air, and that's, if you're in television news, that's what you want is airtime. You can get on the air by having the expose or showing something the dark side. That tends to be much more accepted, and because it gets audience.
And it's probably everybody's fault because the ratings are probably higher for the expose and the bad news.
Absolutely.
So it's like the old Barney Frank line, we politicians are no great shakes, but you voters are no day at the beach either.
Well, and another recent example, with another shout out to Jim Wallace, was when there was a dreadful ad campaign in the New York City subways and on buses recently, which was very negative to our Muslim brethren. A group of Methodist women started posting advertisements, countering advertisements, which sent a positive message about people of all faiths working together. And that was a time where those messages actually drowned out the initial negative ones. So it was a negative was turned around through the activism of the faith community, turned around into a positive. Ibu, I want to throw to you the question. We've been talking about how Americans can be more accepting of others. Is there an obligation of religious groups to put themselves out? When we were looking at the data that Putnam and Campbell had gathered, we saw that two religions which previously had suffered from a lot of prejudice, Roman Catholics and American Jews, are actually perceived in a very positive way. And part of the reason for that, in the case of the Catholics particularly, is that Catholic relief organizations have been active throughout the world. Catholic schools operate in some of our poorest jurisdictions in the United States. Catholic hospitals serve Americans of all sorts. And so what are ways that minority religious groups can get into the mainstream?
So I think the answer to that is yes, unless it is an essential character of your faith to effectively be a bubble, as in the case of, for example, the Amish. In America, they have every right to do that and to build that society. The First Amendment gives you that right, and I think that that's the exact right decision. But if that is not the essential character of your faith, I think that there are obligations of citizenship in this country, and those are obligations of contribution. In fact, in the Washington letter that you quoted earlier, Meryl, he says, after he says that the United States government will give bigotry no sanction and persecution no assistance, he says that in America, the children of the stock of Abraham should be able to sit in safety under their own vine and fig, and there shall be none to make them afraid as long as they demean themselves good citizens. And I think that what he means by that is contributors. So if I think about the Catholic contribution in America, I mean, I'm in this country because Notre Dame University allowed in, a somewhat wayward Indian Muslim immigrant into their MBA program in the mid-1970s. That man was my father. Developed a fierce devotion to fighting Irish football over those 2 or 3 years in South Bend, and we've lived in the Midwest ever since, right? There's 230 Catholic universities in America. You could probably count no more than 5 that are entirely Catholic. In other words, all of the rest of them have built institutions that serve the common good. Same with the 7,000 Catholic grade schools and high schools, same with the 600-odd Catholic hospitals, and that's just a single religious community I'm talking about. And we're not getting into, the range of Catholic social services, right? Faith communities play a huge role in American social capital and social services. Putnam at Harvard says it's 50%. My sense is that
provide 50% of the social capital.
50% of the social capital in America, the hospitals, the philanthropy, the social services, the private schools are driven by faith communities. That's stunning. American society is literally unimaginable if you took that away. right? And I think to myself, as somebody who sent my kids to Catholic schools, as somebody whose parents were entirely Catholic educated, both in India and in the United States, that one day I want to see my religious community building a Muslim hospital that is powered by the resources of the Muslim community that serves everybody. There's a beautiful line in the Holy Quran that says that God made the Prophet Muhammad nothing but a special mercy upon all the worlds, right? Not just not just for Arabs, not just for Muslims, but all the worlds. And I think that it's an obligation of Muslims in America to make that contribution. Let me say that this was one of the reasons I think that I was so particularly stung by the poisonous discourse around the Ground Zero Mosque, around Cordoba House, because it was intended to be the first national level Muslim project that was primarily a civic contribution, as opposed to kind of an internal community project that served as a mosque or a place where Muslims would get married, et cetera, et cetera. It was meant to effectively be a Muslim YMCA. And so my initial reaction to it was, wow, we Muslims are coming of age in America. This is our Georgetown, right? This is our Brandeis. This is our Jewish hospital. And to watch that discourse, I frankly thought I'd entered the twilight zone.
And that didn't get a lot of media attention, what the purpose of that mosque was.
Or that community center, right.
Yeah.
That story got swallowed up in the negative story. Getting back to the question of being left alone, there are groups in America, when we were thinking about this, we actually started thinking in terms of a bell curve, where you have lots of people who are sort of clustered in the middle, and they want to engage with each other given the opportunity, and then there are also the two ends where people may not want to engage. And in the United States, that's one of your rights. You have a right to be left alone. And there are some religious faiths who want to be left alone, and that's also one of their guarantees. But for those who are under that big portion of the bell curve, that engagement is increasingly important, and engagement is something that's being talked about a lot at the Ideas Festival this year, with the discussion of our colleagues in the Franklin Project, the other report that has just been published. And David, you were involved in the conversation, as with EJ and Ibu, both on the Franklin Project. How do these two things relate to each other?
Wonderfully, wonderfully. And I hope that we talk more about this over the next couple of days. Let me just say a word or two about the Franklin Project. A year ago, here at the Ideas Festival, General Stanley McChrystal gave a talk that blew the roof off, calling for national service. And people got very excited by that. There was a lot of conversation that came out of the Ideas Festival. Walter Isaacson, to his great credit, said, let's build on this. He started organizing groups about 9 months ago. He asked General McChrystal to head up the effort, and he agreed to do that. They went off and got two very active, dynamic people to be co-directors in Alan Casey and John Bridgeland, one a Democrat and the other Republican. And here in this room over the last 2 days, we had about 250 leaders of nonprofits, social entrepreneurs, universities, foundations, corporations, you name it. EJ was here, Ibu came yesterday, Jim Wallace was very involved. And I was in Walter's office this morning. The universal review was, a couple of people who have been in this field for a long time on national service said, the most important event to support national service in the last 25 years. And Harris Wofford was there. He's sort of a father of this movement. And now, and it really everybody walked out of here with a great charge. There's a report that was issued yesterday, which I commend to you, and the two reports do dovetail. The Franklin Project report calls for, it's a bold proposal, it calls for enlisting 1 million young people between the ages of 18 and 25 every year. That'd be 1/4 of every age group in service projects. 1 million a year. It's a huge increase, and it changes the culture. And there was a lot of talk here about the CCC and World War II and how they changed the culture of America in mid-century, and how national service could do that again. And clearly, service projects would go back to Ibu's point about social capital coming out of religiously affiliated organizations. Service projects that involve people with different backgrounds and different religions can be a great glue for the country. One of the things we discussed with Merrill, when Madeline and I were there with this group, was that if you sit people down and say, okay, let's talk about your religious differences and how we can heal them, actually it leads to deeper differences. If you just get two people in a room and try to talk about, okay, you're a Muslim, I'm a Christian, let's talk, that doesn't work very well. But if you have a Christian working alongside a Muslim in a project, in a service project, and they get to know each other, serving the common good, they automatically come out of that feeling with a high regard for the other person, and then they see the religion in a very positive light. And that was central to the whole idea of national service.
I think a lot of us, Ibu isn't old enough, but some of us remember those World War II movies. And when you think about how prejudice in the United States declined after World War II, some of it obviously was a reaction to the horror of Nazism and racism and anti-Semitism that led to the Holocaust. But a lot of it was also generated internally. And if you remember in those World War II movies, it was always an Italian guy and an Irish guy and a Jewish guy in the trench together. And I've always thought those movies were why John Kennedy won and Al Smith didn't.
Yeah.
And it was also central to the inclusion of African Americans in American life, because so many African Americans fought and died for our country in that war that prejudice and discrimination meant a whole lot less sense to a whole lot, there were a whole lot of Americans who said this makes no sense. And African Americans said, how can we serve in this way and be treated as second-class citizens when we come home? And by the way, it's why gays and lesbians were correct to, as one of their first demands, to say we want equal treatment in the military. They were saying, we are asking for the chance to sacrifice for the country, for the whole. And so I think the service movement has enormous potential to pull people together in exactly the way David did. It's a sort of reincarnation in a time when we're even more diverse, with Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs and Buddhists, to sort of recreate the spirit of those World War II movies.
And one of the things we would like to see come out of the report, young people today, if you look from that generation, the discussion of race in that generation versus where young people now, 19 to 23, are extremely comfortable in discussions around race, very engaged, very little bias, I mean, an extraordinary change. And what we hope to see emerging from this report is that 10 years down the road, that young people will have the same literacy around religious issues and will be able to engage around discussions with people of different faiths without the baggage that older generations have brought to the table. With that, I did want to open up to questions. We have two members of our distinguished panel here today. We have Jim Wallace and we have Marty Butt. And I wanted to give Jim the first question and Marty, if you have one, the second, and then we'll ask. Or Jim, questions or comments?
Comment, yeah. There's a microphone coming, Jim.
Yeah. Jim Wallace is with Sojourners.
And we'll be on the panel tomorrow, right?
And we'll be on the panel tomorrow about religion in America.
Just to underscore the commitment to action, we had a wonderful, thanks to Merrill and Aspen, wonderful conversations in Washington, D.C. Terrific people, again, great conversations. Unless those conversations move out of places like this, we're going to be in trouble. So action is key, and the media is key. So finishing EJ's story about the Tennessee pastor, it was actually Cordoba, Tennessee, which is interesting. And Tennessee was full of conflict. Like the state house passed a law against Sharia law in Tennessee. Sharia law was a real threat in Tennessee. You know? They passed a law, burning mosques, all of that. So this pastor, Steve Stone, I called him, and the end of that story was this. David, I got CNN Sunday morning to run the story. So here's this pastor and imam side by side. You could tell they liked each other, knew each other, respected each other. I called Steve and said, I got a call last night from Pakistan, Kashmir, Pakistan. A room full of Muslim men called Steve and said, is this the pastor? Steve Stone. He said, yes. He said, yes. We saw that segment on CNN, and we were silent for a long time. And one of us said, I think God may be speaking to us through this man. Another one said, how could we ever want to kill people like this? Another one said, I can't speak for my friend because he doesn't speak English, but he went to the little church near our mosque, and with his own hands, he washed it and scrubbed it, cleaned it. So we're calling, it's 1:30 in the morning, we're calling you, Pastor, to tell your congregation, we don't hate them, we love them. And because of what you did, we're going to look after that little Christian church for the rest of our lives. So how do we take the actions that can change this? Because talk like this is wonderful, but unless we insert different language and behavior and visions in a situation of conflict, we're going to be in trouble. So how do we get that into the conversation? So, and by the way, on the nuns, example of interfaith cooperation. Years ago, when I would speak to evangelical schools in the Midwest, very conservative, I'd walk in and the NUNS nuns, 2 rows of nuns, sitting there, evangelical school. I said, sisters, why are you here? Well, we're local. I said, yeah, but why are you here? Well, Jim, this is a very conservative place. We thought somebody should have your back. So I had nuns as bodyguards for years. So I love that interfaith collaboration.
Marty, do you have anything to add?
Sam Huntington, of blessed memory, pointed out that this century might well be a clash of civilizations. By that he meant the Christians and Muslims. And of course, what happens internationally affects our country in a significant way. And while we do see these clashes around the world, I think it's very important of the kinds of things we're talking about to kind of immunize ourselves. And so I think it's particularly important for the action items to be dispersed and acted on, because I think that we are going to have continual unfortunate influences from around the world, and perhaps again we can influence a little bit as the city shining on the hill as an example to the rest of the world of how to try to ameliorate what looks like a very concerning international set of circumstances.
Questions? Gentleman over here.
There's a microphone coming.
Well, Mike is coming.
Thank you. Don Garlico from Columbus, Ohio. In following up what David said earlier, the media is the message, and the media spreads all out. CNN reported, but no one else did. Until the media helps the process, whether it's political, religious, or anything else we're talking about, do we have a chance?
David and I are looking at each other. You can go both ways on this. I told the story about the burning of the Quran versus this great pastor down in Tennessee, and that is a problem. But I also think attention to religion as opposed to religion as a source of conflict, religion trying to actually understand different faith traditions better. There have been over the years, there was a period when there was remarkably little coverage of religion in the secular media. The New York Times always had pretty strong religion coverage, and there were people scattered around. Then there was actually a buildup in the sort of 90s and early 2000s of genuinely substantive coverage of religion. Go ahead.
What I was trying to say wasn't about religion. We were talking about the good things happening.
But I think that's why I'm raising this, is because I take your point, and I think that in order to cover religion in its totality, as opposed to just those examples of religion leading to hatred or leading to violence, you need to actually take religion seriously enough to give it serious coverage. Now, that doesn't always make religious people happy, because covering it seriously also means covering the flaws of traditions, covering scandals and like, but I think part of the thing that the media can do better is to cover religion itself as a genuinely serious subject. And as I mentioned the story, because I love people like that gentleman in Tennessee and some of the work Ibu does to get a lot more coverage than it does.
Yeah, let me say, I spent a fair amount of my early career living and dying by the daily press, trying to make sure, and on the assumption that a president would live or die by the daily press. I sort of moved beyond that now. I just don't think you can live that way. I think what you have to do is do what's right, keep working on it. Sometimes you'll get good press, sometimes you'll get bad press, sometimes you'll get no press. But if you keep doing it and you build something, the media will eventually cover it in a good way. We cannot let ourselves be paralyzed about what we do socially as a country in terms of what we do with our culture and how we repair the kind of rifts we have and the rips we have in our culture, unless people sort of create a sense of movement and not worry about the media.
There's some great.
I'd love to see good things on the evening news, but you and I are going to be dead before that happens. You know?
Well, and our replacements
And may you
are
live 1,000 years.
our replacements are getting news online, and there's some great stuff going on online, including Paul Rauschenbusch, who runs the HuffPost on religion page, and they're doing some terrific coverage. And Paul, during the course of our panel discussion, made a very interesting point about the new media and of the internet. He said that if you click on certain key phrases, search terms under religion, the first 30 things that come up on Google are all very negative. And it's not until you click down further that you start to see the positives. And one of the things that Paul posited is it would be very nice to see some of those stories move up higher, because the eyes of the world are on us, and those clicks are not just coming from people reading in the United States, but people reading around the world. And how do we highlight those stories, bring them up so that people who are reading in Pakistan or reading in Russia are able to see the good stories first before they see the stories that are not quite as positive.
Yeah. And if we change the culture for young people, they grow up believing that they need to give back, they need to serve, and we need to change this country. When they get into the press, when they become the reporters in the press, they'll have a very different view.
Could I just pick up briefly on the gentleman's comment on Sam Huntington? Sam Huntington was a brilliant man. I don't agree with his sort of overall analysis that we face an inevitable clash of civilizations, and I actually think there are you look at the war in Syria today and you say, well, boy, this is a religious war, although it's an internal Muslim war between Sunni and Shia. But I think there are countervailing forces, and we were talking about this before the panel. One of the fascinating developments is the rise of Pope Francis. And Pope Francis is someone who has taken interreligious dialogue very seriously. His one serious book is a dialogue with a rabbi, and the Jewish community in Argentina was very taken with him. He also, and this in some ways was harder, had excellent relations with evangelicals. And right now, evangelicals and Catholics are engaged in a very tough struggle for souls in Argentina and all across Latin America. And the signals coming out of the Vatican are signals that interreligious dialogue is becoming more important. And similarly, I think there are forces in the Muslim world who are pushing in this direction. And I'd like to know what Ibu thinks of this. I think if you look at our Catholic tradition, the American Catholics, because we were shaped, I always say, and many of my friends in the Vatican agree, that we're all a little bit Protestant, but because we were shaped by our pluralist tradition, American Catholics were strong advocates of religious freedom. Nothing like being in a religious minority to believe in religious freedom. And they had a large effect at the Second Vatican Council and on the opening up of Roman Catholicism to both democracy and the idea of religious liberty. I do think American Muslims, Muslims do not have the centralized structures that the Catholic Church has, but I think there's a real powerful kind of dialogue that can be started and that you've been part of, where I don't like saying America has everything to teach the world. I love America, but we have things to learn from the world too. But I think this is something where we do have something very particular that might be helpful to the world. I'm curious what your experience in this.
So
area is.
every time one of us pauses, like 8 more hands go up. So can we get a
Why
couple
don't
more
we'll
questions in
we'll
there?
give Ibu the
The
last
first-
word, but let's
yeah.
get a couple more questions.
I'm happy
And
to answer that. I
The lady
just
in the
wanna make
black jacket over here, I know you've been patient.
I'm Paula Kerger, I'm the president of PBS, and part of the reason that I was so interested in this panel is that on a sustained basis, we are covering these stories. And I know that sometimes all programs don't rise up to large audience, but we did a project a year or 2 ago on the Amish, and it was one of the highest rated front lines in recent history. So I think there's an interest and an appetite in understanding, and not just the reality shows that also focus on some of these same subjects. And I think that there is, to come back to your question, because I'm trying to give you a little hope here. Media is tremendously powerful. I think there is a role for the media to play in telling the range of stories about the religious community, but I think one of the great opportunities for the future, particularly as I look at the work that you're doing with young people, is around social media. And I think there's enormous power to get stories out that really accurately talk about what is going on, particularly in this country, and social media can be a tremendous catalyst for that.
You know, one of the things we say at Interfaith Youth Corps all the time is we talk about the science of interfaith cooperation. We now know what works in this field. That's very important because for many, many decades we didn't. But we also talk about the art of interfaith leadership. And the art of interfaith leadership can be boiled down to a single line. If it's not inspiring, no one cares. Right? And so we tell our young people all the time, don't blame the local newspaper for not covering your event. It's your job to make it compelling. Right? Don't blame people for not coming to something. It's your job to make it inspiring. That is part of what you have to be in this. One of the reasons we say this is because if you want to go back to the proverbial turtle on the fence, right? Religious extremists, particularly Muslim extremists, they are intentional about getting on the evening news. You think about this. They videotape their suicide bombings. Why do they do that? Because the impact they want to have is not just 10 dead Russian soldiers in the Chechen forest. It's 4 million viewers in America seeing Islam as a totalitarian tradition, right? So they have figured out a way to get on the evening news. And I joke that if you're a toothpaste company, you got to pay $50,000 for that 30-second spot. But if you're a religious extremist, all you got to do is videotape your beheading, and the media will give you the airtime for free.
Ibu, I want to get in 2 more questions, then we'll give David and Ibu the last words here. There's a lady in a purple shirt.
Hi, my name is Carlene Chow, and one thing that has struck me at the very end of the conversation was you guys started to go on to the issue of race. And for me, during the whole dialogue about prejudice and religion and American pluralism, I thought it was a very, it's very linked with issues of race. And I was surprised at the direction that you guys went at the end, because my feeling is that that race and prejudice in the US is still a very divisive and a scar in sort of American society. And I was curious, especially from Ibu's perspective, and I wanted to know if the report touches on this, to what extent do you think race relations is also influenced in the religious discussion? I mean, when people are suddenly against Muslims and they attack somebody who's just a person of color and they just see issues, for me it seems a very linked issue, and I was surprised you didn't go into more discussion on that.
So, I think it's linked as well. There's no doubt about it. One reason it's linked is because there are religious communities in the United States that have a heavy racial character as well. So the Black Protestant tradition, for example, would be one example of that. You still have a number of ethnically oriented mosques. You'll have a Bosnian mosque, you'll have a Syrian mosque, you'll have an Egyptian mosque, you'll have a Pakistani mosque. So these things are undoubtedly linked. There's the great line by W.E.B. Du Bois at the beginning of the 20th century that the problem of the 20th century is going to be the problem of the color line. I think in the 21st century, we continue that problem of the color line and how we engage that, but we've inherited a new line, which is the faith line. So in effect, we have to negotiate both of these things right now. And of course, there's other issues as well: class, sexuality, gender, etc. But we're negotiating a multiplicity of these lines right now. I think that the thing that makes religion distinctive is the role that it's playing in international conflict. The fact that it's the kind of the storyline of our times, and that it impacts people's views, prejudices, and relationships in the United States. This is not to say that race is a back burner issue, only that, famously in the 1980s and 1990s, I think Foreign Affairs had 6 articles on religion. Right? In other words, it dramatically de-emphasized a hugely important dimension of the human condition. We can't de-emphasize religion anymore.
Could I offer one sentence and then turn it over to David? The one sentence is, I agree with what you said, and all we have to do is look back at the Ku Klux Klan. Who was it against? It was against Jews, it was against Catholics, and it was against African Americans. And I think prejudice in our history has often involved overlapping forms of prejudice, and sometimes, as Ibu said, racial prejudice reinforces religious prejudice or the other way around. So I think the premise of your question is well taken.
Yeah, I just have very little to say here. Look, from my perspective, given where we were back in the 60s, we've made enormous progress on racial prejudice. I do think we are in a period where it's getting worse, not better. In President Obama's first term, it looked very promising. I thought we were moving toward a real breakthrough. I think there's a lot of anecdotal evidence now that we're moving backwards. And it's something to be very concerned about. I don't think it's terrible yet, but I think it's there. And what's changed, though, is those people are losing. They're on the wrong side of history. With the millennial generation, it's 40% minority. This white racism is going to end. I mean, it's going to be pockets of it forever, but they're on the wrong side, and they're going to lose.
Well, it's past 4:30, and so we're going to wrap it up to allow you to enjoy all the other activities, but I did want to give Ibu the last word.
Do I have the last word? So here's my last word, that I think that George Washington line, thing to remember about that is that was in response to a Jewish leader who wrote him in 1790, a man named Moses Sessions, and basically said, what's going to happen to Jews in this new nation, right? We know what's happened to Jews in the last several centuries in Europe. They've been hounded and hated and harassed. What's going to happen in this new nation? And the first president of the United States of America puts a stake in the ground and says, this nation will give bigotry no sanction and persecution no assistance. He ends that letter with the line, may the Lord of all mercies scatter light and not darkness, and make each of us useful in our own vocations, and give us everlasting happiness in his own way. And it feels to me like what he is saying right there is the most American thing you can do, is stand up for someone from a different background. And I think that's the most important action step we can be taking heading out of this room.
And with that benediction, we send you all off.